Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Mark Azulay, and I'm here with Desmond Cohen. He's one of our great therapists at MTO, and I'm really excited for this episode because Desmond has this pet project where he's been tracking gender norms through reality TV shows, specifically The Bachelor. So I'm excited just to like buckle in and just be here for the ride as we learn about kind of how modern masculinity is shifting in the mainstream. Desmond, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, this promises to be a weird one. Um,
I love the weird ones, man.
so, so you said that you're a total novice to the universe of The Bachelor, is that right?
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah, I've never
Okay.
seen a single episode, so pitch it to me.
So the Bachelor series, it's a multi-show universe at this point, media empire probably. Um, so it started in like 2002, and it's kind of classic reality TV from that it's like the second generation of reality TV. We get the first generation back in the 90s from MTV. This is kind of the next generation where they were evolving it into something even more outrageous. Um, so the I had fun geeking out about this before the show. The apparently what defines reality TV is a crossover of documentary style filmmaking with soap opera style production. And that is one of the big defining characteristics of it. And this kind of fits the bill perfectly for that. So the frame of the show is that the original show was called The Bachelor, and it was one guy and like 20-ish women. And it's kind of changed and evolved over the years. But there's one guy and a lot of women basically. And the idea is he is supposed to meet these women through they call them cocktail parties where they're talking for like, I don't know, like 5, 10 minutes at a time with individuals. And then they get to go on dates periodically over the course of like a couple of weeks, basically. And over the course of the show, the contestants get whittled down until there is just a couple left at the end. And then the final act is a proposal. Um, so that's the frame of the show. That the actual structure of it hasn't really changed all that much in the like 20 plus years that it's been on the air now. They have added the Bachelorette, which flips the script, and it's one woman and a bunch of men. And then they also have they have Bachelor in Paradise, where they take contestants who have usually been on the show already, who have the right combination of attractiveness and dramatic qualities, and they just kind of put them together and blend them to make dramatic stuff happen.
Awesome.
Um,
Great. It's like the greatest
yeah,
hits. Yeah.
prime reality TV.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Um, so it's funny that I forget exactly how you said it when you introduced me as it's like a pet project. So I got introduced to this series in a way that a lot of people do, and a lot of men do actually, which is by my partner who was female. And the show originally was targeting, and still to this day, was specifically targeting a primarily like female audience. And the I got pulled in from a desire to basically, my wife wanted to share this experience with me. Um, and she got me into it by gamifying it. So, really in like a tragic, dehumanizing way, basically creating stat sheets about the contestants and seeing if we could like bet with each other about who was going to win
Nice.
the show,
Yeah.
become the last contestants based on broad statistics that we identified at the beginning. And then like broad affect stuff that we could try to match. Shockingly accurate. It's fairly easy, or it used to be fairly easy. And there was a whole subculture of people who basically did this, taking like kind of like sports betting into the reality TV era. And it was oddly fun.
Hmm.
This was going on when I was in grad school. And so there was this uh, experience of both like a cathartic dehumanization of other people at a time when I was being trained to be extremely empathetic
Hmm.
and put a lot of my effort and like energy into caring about other people. This was like the opposite, where I was basically being conditioned and told that I was supposed to be dehumanizing people, which was weird. Um, there's some really disturbing aspects of the show historically. It's been extremely racist. It's been like the gender roles that historically they have prized have been, uh, we'd say traditional, but like pretty, like very narrow and pretty limited.
Mhm.
Um, and there's been a lot, like, kind of about a lot of backlash about that, especially in the last 10 years. Originally, the show was kind of, there wasn't a lot of effort or awareness paid to this. But as the show was getting more, I don't know if it was more viewership, but definitely a changing viewership,
Mhm.
people started giving feedback that the contestants on the show didn't feel like real people, or didn't feel like they were actually like people who were attractive in the way that real people wanted to date anymore. Originally, these contestants were supposed to be the like paragons of their genders and sexual presentations. Um, the That kind of started to shift, it seemed like, at a certain point. And we entered the era of what I would call the arms race, where it basically became focused, like for the male contestants, it became focused on exclusive, like physical attributes of like
Mhm.
who could get the biggest. And the contestants became like football players and like a lot of pro athletes, or like pro amateur athletes. And then just like, you're like casual bodybuilders. And like the emphasis was put on people who looked a certain way but didn't necessarily have like a depth of life
Yeah,
that
yeah.
would make them like a meaningful partner or like even a sustainable partner. And this kind of shows in the statistics for what happens to the relationships that are formed by the show, which is like not super positive. It's
Right.
rare that the relationships formed by the show actually like lead to a lasting marriage, let alone like a lasting relationship. Um, so all this stuff became more and more known as the social media presence started to get bigger. There became this like back and forth cultural exchange and dialogue between the people who are watching the show and the production team who's creating the show. And so the show started to evolve. I'm going to pause as the novice. How am I doing at explaining this so far?
No, this makes a ton of sense, and it's fascinating of how deep it goes and how engaged like the community is. I think that's awesome actually. Like I love learning about little niches of like culture and society and like people that like have these like deep rabbit holes and stuff. So I love hearing that you were like, creating stat cards for them basically, right? And like doing the betting. Like that sounds actually pretty fun. I think I could get into that myself. Yeah, I guess a question I have for you before we move on. You talk about that early era and my kind of understanding of like early 2000s TV, reality TV. It was like it's kind of like the South Park era where a lot of it was made like it was pretty racist in a lot of ways, right? But it was like I guess my understanding is that reality TV show was made to make fun of in a way, right? Like the characters were almost edited or created or whatever to be mocked. But it sounds like that changed or that's changing now where it actually they're trying to say something or they're trying to be like a message with it
Mm,
or yeah, how would you answer that?
maybe. So
Yeah.
I don't actually, yeah, isn't a piece that I had thought of. I haven't seen a ton of the early seasons.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
my understanding was that there's definitely like if you think back, I guess my like touchstone for this would be like the real world and like
Mhm.
that kind of era of reality TV where it was kind of like one part this uh this like fantasy life of like oh they're living in a mansion and they're like doing cool stuff and like look at their cool like skateboards on the wall and like how cool would it be? It's aspirational for like the 13-year-old, right?
Mhm.
That's kind of who it was geared towards. And I think that that's probably where the show started too, was this idea of like creating these partners who are aspirational for like teenagers, essentially. Um, but what started happening maybe is that those teens started growing up. And
Mhm.
that's like that was my wife's experience is that she like got exposed to this stuff when she was a teen and then like periodically would kind of like step back into it. But she was watching this in our mid 20s. And so the things that are attractive to a mid 20-year-old are going to be very different than what's attractive to like 14-year-old. Um, and I guess maybe that's the theory is that they had to
Mhm.
start kind of up aging it in a
Yeah.
different way because a 25-year-old is going to see through a lot of the like shallow aspirational things of like a 20-year-old.
Mhm.
Um, so the show kind of like walked this weird line where they were trying to cater to both. And they would have, like 20-year-olds on the show who were like sparkly and so like cut or like so beautiful in a very specific way, but who had like no life experience and like no emotional intelligence and like nothing to say beyond like I'm here and I'm ready for love. And it was like it did kind of shift into this like joke of like these people, they all started doing so here's another shift. The contestants on the show started becoming people who grew up watching the show.
Oh, that's
And that
interesting.
was
So
a
there's like a
big shift.
meta level to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So originally the contestants were like, "Oh, I'm going to go on a reality show that I don't really know much about." And they're usually like out of work actors and things and
Hmm.
people who got pulled off the street or whatever. Um, the but so they didn't have this idea about how the show was supposed to work.
Hmm.
So the production team basically got to like steer it towards whatever the heck they wanted. You start getting this change when pretty much everyone on the show, or the vast majority of people on the show who are contestants, are steeped in the larger reality
Hmm.
of what this thing is supposed to be. And they've already been conditioned to respond to the stimuli of the show in a specific way. So it's instead of showing up for a thing that's going to be filmed documentary style, it's like they've been watching the play from when they were 13 years old, and now they get to be a cast member in the play. So they're already expecting to act a certain way, and that's when we get to kayfabe. Which do you want to explain kayfabe to people who maybe not know what it
Yeah,
is?
I don't know what it stands for. Do you know what it stands for? Like, what does it mean?
uh, I saw the wiki page was funny.
Because it's an
There was
acronym,
like one
right?
theory that it was. I didn't see that it was an acronym for anything. Um, the closest thing that I saw was that it's a carnival term,
Okay.
but I don't know what it is. Like, yeah, I didn't see any like
What it actually
specific.
means. Okay, yeah, because I don't know. Yeah, the only thing I know is from wrestling or from like WWE, right? I
Mhm.
think that's maybe where it came to popularity. At least that's where I heard about it first. And
Yeah,
kayfabe, this idea that like you're always in character, right? Because I think it was. I mean, I probably wasn't a big surprise to learn that wrestling was fake, right? And that it's scripted, and that it's like again, it's probably similar to this, where it's real. Like it's real athletics, but it is also that soap opera type thing that you talked about in the first
yeah,
segment, right? Um, so the idea of kayfabe is that the characters, like The Rock or I don't know, all these people, right? Like they are still their wrestling character in the world. So when they go out to eat, they're still the character. When they're on social media, they're still the character. When they're doing interviews, they're still the character. Like they don't drop the act, versus like most other actors. If you see an actor doing an interview promoting a show, they're just themselves, right? And often they have like a different accent or whatever. You're like, oh shit, I didn't know so and so was Australian, you know?
mhm,
And they're just talking about their experience working on the show or on the movie. Whereas in wrestling, the protocol was like you are always the character.
yeah,
Um, so this bleeds
yeah,
over into The Bachelor, I'm assuming.
yeah. That's basically what this started to take on
Yeah,
was a total parallel with wrestling, where the show itself became one stage, but
yeah.
everything surrounding the show became an additional part of the stage where you're not supposed to be breaking character. And the what the level of acting associated with being on the stage started getting more and more complex
Hmm.
and more tuned to be a certain thing. And that's where we started to see this like really rapid and intense communication about what is the aspirational gender role that I'm supposed to be portraying here.
Hmm.
So the
Well, hold on. Can I ask you questions about the show? So at
Mhm.
this point, is it like WWE? Like, is it fake? Like are these people actors? Right? Are they given roles by these producers or whatever? Or are they like extent? Or are they creating their own characters? I don't know. I'm curious. Like what the yeah.
Yeah, that's part of the unknown for me
Part of
still.
the
There's
mystery.
like apparently there's books about this and there's people like who have podcasts just about the Bachelor universe
Yeah.
who talk about this. One of my partner has favorite games to play when we watch the show is what did the producers say to prime the person to
Mhm.
make them say that line, basically, of like, they have people speak in full statements of like, oh, I think Sally's stupid and mean.
Mhm.
And then so the game is like, what was the producer's question to get them to say that in a discreet way of like, do you think Sally is stupid and mean?
Mhm.
It could be as leading as that.
Yeah.
Um, but that's the part that starts to be the like it seems like the art of the production for
Yeah.
them is how can we cultivate this and steer this in a way to generate the narrative that we want
Hmm.
while still making it appear to be authentic.
Hmm.
And there are times it really ebbs and flows. There are times where it feels like the production team seems to like hit a new level. Um, and all of a sudden it starts to feel real in a weird, different way. And there are times when it feels so stupid and so
Hmm.
scripted. And I don't know if it's like the specific contestants. You can tell, uh, especially at the beginning of the season, when there's a lot of people who is able to play the game and who isn't.
Yeah.
Because you'll have contestants who are like acting like normal people. And they're on this and they're like, they feel like they're crazy. And they look kind of like they're like the sane person in like the zoo. I had a funny story. I had a friend of a friend who was a contestant on the show, and he got almost no screen time. He was a very sweet person,
Hmm.
really smart, really funny, but like a normal person. And like super attractive, and he goes on the show, he gets zero screen time, and he's eliminated after like night one.
Because he's just not
Because there was
generating like drama, or he's not generating like, yeah, any
yeah,
kind of intrigue.
he
Yeah.
can't insert himself really effectively, and he's not interesting enough that the production team wants to keep him around,
Yeah.
basically.
So
I don't
he
know if it was
just
night
gets
one, but it was like
sidelined.
2 days. Yeah,
He's a
and that's what
background
happens
character. Yeah.
is you start to get
Yeah.
there's this weird interplay between it's like it's like the horse racing thing where it's like
Yeah.
who is being kept on the show in order to find love with the contestant and who's being kept on the show because they're dramatic and they're allowed to
Yeah.
basically have a narrative arc. And that because the show's been going on so long, people start to spec into this by themselves.
Hmm.
So you can see a contestant who goes on the show, who starts thinking that maybe they're going to be able to find love, and they realize that they're not going to be the person who wins the show, so they start getting wackier and creating drama in order to stay on the show longer. Um,
It's so good.
and
Yeah.
what this all comes down to at this point is followers, because
Yeah.
that's the way that you take this thing and turn it into something bigger,
Yeah.
is you monetize it essentially. So your drama becomes directly monetized very quickly.
Yeah, it's like a
It's wild.
platform to make the like people's personal brands, right? Because yeah, because I know that there are some reality TV show stars that like go on different shows, right? And like that's like their life is like being this wacky character that has a following. This is really interesting. We're gonna move to our first commercial break. When we get back, I want to dig into the gender norms piece and talk about kind of the male contestants and what you've studied from there. But this is a this is a really fascinating conversation, Desmond. I really appreciate you bringing it to the show. So if you're listening, hang on in there, and we'll see you on the other side of the commercial break. Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Desmond Cohen, one of our phenomenal therapists at MTO, and we're just chatting about The Bachelor, man. I really enjoyed kind of the background and seeing how deep the rabbit hole goes around The Bachelor and around the viewership and the production team. And yeah, I mean, it's got my head spinning just on like the I don't know, the like endeavor and the undertaking that this thing is, to put on TV and yeah, just like showcase relationships and norms. But yeah, let's dive into our topic, which is kind of tracking the male contestant and how gender norms are portrayed through that show. So yeah, what have you noticed about that?
Yeah. So that's been an interesting evolution. Even in the last 5 years, there's been a
Yeah.
really remarkable shift. The so I kind of talked a little bit about this idea of who the like aspirational contestants were for a long time. And it started as kind of like like a normal-ish person. And then as the show got more advanced and got a bigger viewership and the production quality got more and more complex, um, the contestants themselves started becoming these kind of larger than life people.
Hmm.
Um, and I talked about it as the arms race, where it really became like a physical thing of like who is, and it kind of showed in the production too, where it's like they used like way more like shower shots, where it's like, oh, every episode, make sure you show like at least 3 minutes of the guy showering and like soaping up his body because that's how we're marketing this.
Like who's the most
And
jacked man? Like that's the apex
yeah,
masculinity. Yeah.
yes, yeah. So apex masculinity was really focused on looks
Yeah.
and on muscles at this time.
Yeah.
And the way that it was presented outside of that, or like it was pretty limited and pretty
Hmm.
shallow. Like they wouldn't really push on elements of being a human and being a man outside of like raw strength. Um, so what changed is my assumption is it's the culture. So there started to be a lot of pushback. My assumption is probably viewership was either dipping or there was a lot of like online backlash
Hmm.
against what was happening because the contestants started to shift and evolve and they became older for a little while. We started to see instead of just people in their like early to mid 20s, the contestants started becoming like mid late 20s and then we started seeing some in their 30s
Hmm.
and the level of easy intimacy and emotional intelligence just skyrocketed by having more mature contestants on this show. The depth and quality of the conversations was shockingly different. And a lot of, again, this is my assumption, a lot of viewers seem to be responding in a really powerful way to it because it really seems like that's where they started moving the show. And it went two different directions. So the first direction is that the male contestants started becoming the arms race basically shifted from just physical, like your physique, although that's still important and start part of the baseline. You got to be jacked.
Hmm.
Um, but what they started doing was flexing on each other with their emotional intelligence.
Okay.
It became the drama started becoming focused on was like who was more aware emotionally about what was happening.
Mm.
And the language started shifting. First of all, there wasn't a lot of language around this at first. It was just like bros getting in each other's face and be like, bro, you're stupid, and like getting in stupid dramatic arguments and like storming off and like doing weird things. Now they started talking about stuff and they would form coalitions and they would it was like watching a developmental uh, move up into like later teen years or something, which is still odd that we're watching 20-year-old men acting like teenagers. But that's what they're doing. And it was an improvement over what was happening before because they're talking with each other. They're trying to give each other support.
Hmm.
They're trying to offer emotional support to the female contestants if they're the Bachelor.
Hmm.
And the what so there's always been this relationship between who the Bachelor contestant is and who the Bachelorette men are because it's the bigger pool, right? And they usually or often draw the Bachelor contestant from the Bachelorette pool of men from a previous season,
Okay. Yeah.
or at least recently.
Yeah.
So you get to watch this big pool
Hmm.
of men playing out variations of identity and masculinity and all this stuff. And the Bachelor men who were selected out of this started being basically they had to have the ability to be emotionally supportive to the women. And that then started rubbing off on their ability to be supportive to each other
Hmm.
when they were in the bachelorette pool. So you started seeing that the men who were successful were the ones who could create safety, who could create um, like more meaningful conversations, who could reduce the drama instead of ratchet it up.
Hmm.
Um, it's like they're like the coolers to use like Roadhouse, right?
Hmm.
That kind of in some ways became the version of masculinity, except without the like assault components. It was like an emotional cooler essentially of like who can show up to these spaces and approach conflict and emotional like people's fear and insecurity, which is all part of this and
Hmm.
part of what the production team is trying to get people to feel by first of all sleep depriving them massively and feeding them as many drinks as they can drink.
Hmm.
That's part of this, is by the way. So you're seeing people in extremes often,
Yeah.
and the people who could function in those spaces and hold on to their capacity to be basically create safety ended up becoming more and more successful.
Hmm.
And you started seeing that the men who would have been like prime bachelor men in the past were being less and less successful and were getting like hounded out essentially. And they would just like, they would fizzle out and just like burn up really quick.
Hmm.
Or they weren't interesting enough anymore because they couldn't compete on the same level. Um, so that's what we started seeing in the last 5 years is this like interesting dynamic where sometimes it was like the playing field started getting muddy all of a sudden. So it wasn't just the like super jacked guy with the like nice job who could like pretend like he was a really nice guy who would be successful. It started becoming the people who could actually do that, who were maybe more likely to be competitive longer term. And then they started winning, and then they started becoming the bachelors. And this culminated in the most recent season with this guy, Joey, who was the bachelor. And the apparently the online feedback was extraordinary because this guy, my response when I watched
Hmm.
him first as a bachelorette contestant and then as a bachelor, I was like, he talks like a therapist. Is he supposed to be doing that? Like that's my job. Like why is he supposed to be doing that in a relationship? This guy was able to basically show up and provide the type of emotional support
Hmm.
that these women have been craving for a long, long time.
Hmm.
And that was part of my wife's feedback when I said that was like, this is the bar has been so low for so long that this looks out of place, and yet this ideally is the baseline.
Hmm.
And that was part of the feedback is like we want that more. So that was one path that the show went is basically this construction of masculinity that basically required men to be able to talk about feelings, both their own and then be supportive of other people's feelings.
Hmm.
And like not just like say it in a like a shallow or accepting way, but they had to be able to engage with it in a meaningful way and actually help people like feel validated and then also prove that they had done their own depth work
Hmm.
as a part of it, which was also fascinating because then how do you prove you've done your depth work? And watching people struggle with how to do that on TV of like, this is my trauma and I've worked with it in this way. We joke about it as like your sob story. If you're in the contestant pool, the big pool, you have to have your sob story and it has to come out at the right point. Because if you do it too soon, then it doesn't hit hard enough. If you do it too late, then you might not get enough intimacy. So you got to hit it all right, and it's got to be the right kind of sob story. It's got to hit just. You
Right.
got to
Yeah.
have.
It can't be
It's all
too
part of the narrative.
traumatizing that it like floods them, right? But it can't be like
Exactly.
too lame that people are like, really? That's your thing, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it has to be, uh, yeah, that's part of it. It has to be healed enough
Right.
that you're a great partner now, but not so healed that the person can't still be supportive for you because you're creating an opportunity for them to be supportive for you. It's insane.
Yeah. Well,
But
I mean,
it's like,
I went through this. I mean, when I was doing a lot of online dating, right, after being in therapy for like whatever 6, 7 years at the time, I was like, when do I talk about my childhood, right? When do I talk about like
yes.
my addiction? Like when do I do the big reveal about like my trauma? So like I get this, right? Because it's like important to me, but also not that important to me. But also like you should tell somebody about it, but maybe you don't
Yeah.
want to tell them about it in the wrong way. I don't know, right? But like I get that struggle, you know. Um,
So that's what I'm curious about. I was talking about this with a bunch of my guy friends recently, and that was part of the feedback was it was about dating. And they were like,
yeah,
the my
yeah,
experience of online dating in the last year has been that women only want to talk to me if I've done therapy.
Yeah.
And they were like, but how do I do that? How do I like communicate that in a way that feels meaningful? And how do I know that they actually like, is that just performative on their part too, where it's just like another checkbox of
Hmm.
like, how much can you lift, bro?
Hmm.
Um, I guess I'd be curious. Yeah, what's your perspective on that? Like this is kind of, I guess this is where the conversation kind of leads is like, now that mental health is
Yeah.
going mainstream, we're seeing it in reality TV
Yeah.
as part of this relationship. What is the relationship between therapy as like performative uh, competition versus performative as like useful help? There's this kind of interesting gray area there, and I'd be curious about your perspective, both as a therapist and as someone who's in the dating pool more recently.
Yeah, I think it's tricky, right? And I think it's kind of what you're saying is there's a difference between saying, "Oh yeah, I went to therapy and here's like my graduation certificate. I can talk about my trauma and like not cry, but maybe cry just enough, but like still be open," right? There's like that threading the needle. And then there's what I think is more important, what you're saying is like actually showing up in the present moment, right? Like when the shit goes bad, because it always will, like leaning into that conflict, stating your needs, showing up for your partner when, they suffer a loss, right? Like actually demonstrating it, I think is more what women want, right? Because they want to feel emotionally safe and they want to feel protected in all dimensions, right, including emotional. Um, and I think, but you have to pitch it, right? Because dating is performative, right? It is like showing off some of the best aspects of yourself and trying to be
Mm,
attractive, right? And like stimulate romance. Like there is like a be yourself aspect, but when I tell my guys that are dating, it's like be yourself times like 2.5, right? Like try to like you have to
mm,
like accentuate yourself a little bit, especially in the beginning because you only have a limited amount of time. And rejection is really easy these days, right? Because there's always another person to swipe on, right? It's like very high stakes, especially for men, because I think there's tends to be way more men in the pool, and the women. I mean, it's a whole gender dynamics, but the women that are getting dates, there are many women that don't get any dates, which is fucked up. But the women that are getting dates, which are the ones that you're dating, have like a ton of bachelors, right, that they can go to at all times, right?
mhm.
They're often talking to multiple people. They're often dating multiple people. Like their issue is like filtering, right? Where the men's issue is like getting in front of the woman that you want to date. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, probably similar to the game shows. I mean, similar to the Bachelor and Bachelorette, like you're talking about. Like you only have a limited amount of screen time to talk about your stuff. Um, but I mean, it's kind of like a rambly answer. But I do think by and large, I think it's good. I think it's good for our industry. I think like TikTok mental health is toxic in a lot of ways, but I think in this way, it's actually very helpful where like women are starting
Mm,
to ask, like, are you in therapy? Have you done your work? Right. Like, I think it's way more mainstream to ask that question and to see therapy as something good for you, not that you're like crazy or a drug addict. I mean, I think that's been like a major
yeah.
shift, especially with the younger generation.
Sure.
Um, but yeah, I think it's tricky. I mean, what do you think about it?
Well, I wrote down a note in what you said
Yeah.
because I didn't want to forget it, which is that question of have you done your work? And I feel like I've heard that a lot, and we
Yeah.
talk about it. It's really getting a lot of cultural play right now. But it kind of encapsulates a lot, and it seems like it's also one of those like gray things as a term. And I was reading Esther Perel's book recently, Mating in Captivity,
Hmm.
and it seemed like she kind of tapped into this. I think that book is like 15 or 20 years old now or something. But she was kind of tapping into this uh, dynamic at seemed like a much earlier stage that we're also seeing now, which is the work is the idea that we, especially men of this generation, like you're in my generation, we didn't get to learn this stuff from previous generations. This wasn't something that was modeled to us. And because of that, we have to go outside of those historic spaces to find access to this skill set. And that for us generally seems like it's meeting therapy, but that's one of the only places we can go to get access to these tools.
Hmm.
Um, and that seems like the work is like learning how to, yeah, it's like learning how to talk intimacy instead of just do intimacy. And I think that you and I have talked about that. You've talked about it a lot on the podcast. The one of the strengths of men is often our ability to do like physical intimacy.
Hmm.
So whether it's sexuality, whether it's like shared labor, shared experiences, that is one of the ways that men have bonded for a long time. But it's not one of the ways that women are
Right.
often socialized to accept intimacy and to communicate with intimacy. And that's been one of the big conflicts that Esther Perel talked about a lot. She's talking specifically about how this plays out with sexual relationships. Um, but it seems like it's kind of showing this gulf that's existed for a long time where women have been basically doing both, trying to operate in both languages. So getting socialized to communicate through
Hmm.
talk, through emotion, experience their emotions and share their emotions through talk and language. And men are getting socialized to do it through our bodies primarily. And women have been doing the work of bridging to the physical world as often as they can often. And now men are starting to do that same work and bridging to the social side. And ideally, we get to a point where everyone is able to do both.
Hmm.
And we'll obviously have our proclivities and our tendencies and all that inside of it. But yeah, hopefully we get to a point where it's just two languages to we can have more tools, ideally.
Right. We have more tools, and I think for men, we get needs met that we didn't even know we had. Because I do think men need
Mm-hmm.
to be emotionally intimate, right? And we need to talk to each other about shit. And we need that even though we don't have the tools for it. So I think by expanding these definitions of masculinity and building out more tool sets, we're starting to become better, healthier people in general, right? Which will make the world a better place. So there's a lot to talk about here. We have to move to our next commercial break. When we come back, I want to talk about wrap up The Bachelor, talk about some ideas around like emotional labor, because that's where was going through my head of like what that means, for men and women, and
Mm-hmm.
going through like what the next step might be for a guy who wants to build these tools and become the Bachelor in his life, become this version of
Yeah.
a modern man. So more stuff on the other side of the commercial break. Hang on in there, and we'll see you then. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about The Bachelor. Before we move on, I was curious as you were tracing kind of this evolution of masculinity, right? Going from what you call the arms race, which I think is awesome, like the most jacked, raw strength dude, to a more emotionally intelligent, emotionally aware, emotionally supportive man. I'm wondering, did the way that the women talk about the men change? Like how are they perceiving this shift, whether on The Bachelorette or on The Bachelor?
Yeah, I think it's an important question. And it's definitely something that has had its own like gray area of evolution where you see people kind of pushing back and forth inside of that as the general trend seems to
Yeah.
be a shift towards identifying these traits overall. But you see people still, feeling attraction to just someone's appearance and someone's career and someone's, all these other hallmarks that are a natural part of attraction. That this other one just started to basically play more and more of a role as people started seeing the impact that it had on both their feeling in relationship and then potentially the longevity and sustainability of the relationship after the show. It started to play a greater and greater role in more and more contestants. But it wasn't just like a black and white overnight thing. Um, I think one of the ways that it really stood out to me was the contrast again between the older and the younger contestants when they started having people on the show who were 30 years old interacting with like 20-year-olds and 22-year-olds. They would sometimes like make comments about that where they're like, you're a child, or like I feel like I could like chew you up and spit you out, not in like a mean or aggressive way, but just like this recognition of the huge gulf that existed developmentally between them. And you started seeing people getting treated differently as a part of that, where the super cute person with the who's the airline pilot or whatever it was who like again used to be more competitive would just kind of start to fall as an archetype would start to kind of fall further and further behind and be less and less um, invested in both by the production team and then also by other contestants. So that's a big part of this is that there is this relationship between the producers and what they think the audience is wanting
Mm-hmm.
and the contestants themselves and what they are trying to tap into with their real authenticity
Mm-hmm.
um, of following genuine attraction when it does exist. So there's this constant back and forth. I think that answers your question.
It does.
Uh,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It sounds like it is being taken up, and whether it's probably both, right? It's like both creating a narrative and responding to a cultural narrative that I think is happening in our culture, where
mhm.
there is much more of this, yeah, just like preference on emotional intelligence, and it makes me think, as you were talking before about this idea of emotional labor, which I think came out of either the current wave of feminism, maybe third wave feminism, this idea of specifically women doing a lot of emotional labor in a relationship. And I
Mhm.
think women are getting tired of that, right? And I think I'm curious your thoughts. So my definition of emotional labor is, kind of stereotypical thing of the woman asking a bunch of questions of the man, like being his therapist, right? And the guy being
Yeah.
pretty much like a stonewall, not being able to express himself, maybe not wanting to express himself, or the woman like managing a complex social dynamics in, at a party or at a, I don't know, kid's school or something, right? Like
Mhm.
basically them doing all the emotional work in a relationship, and the guy either being naive and ignorant, which I think a lot of us are, and because we
Mhm.
just don't know, we just like don't know that skill set, or willfully kind of just pushing it away and dismissing it. So I think like with the rise of social media mental health, there's been this like big backlash against doing any kind of emotional labor. So I think when a woman can see a male partner picking up some of that, I think it's very attractive to them, because I think that's
Yeah.
been a huge part of a relationship, a heterosexual relationship that like is has not been talked about. That is a huge role that traditionally women have played in a relationship that hasn't really gotten much credibility. You know.
Sure. Yeah, there's been again coming back to the franchise as an interesting
Yeah.
barometer of this. We saw that where the male contestants are showing there's this tension in the early seasons of first first just being strong in the face of anything, like the classic like numbed, I'm happy or I'm nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then we start to see this push into being able to express sadness about something and able to receive support in the face of that. So that's when we really start to see this push into the women who are picking up the emotional tab for these men. That the hallmark then of an emotionally mature man at that time looked like being a client to a therapist,
Mm-hmm.
where your partner or your dating partner is like your mom or your therapist or like your nanny or whatever it is, which is a super fatiguing position to be in, but was like that was the bar at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And then we start to see this greater depth associated with that, and we start to see men asking, trying to like equal the playing field a little bit of like, oh, let me support you as well. Sorry, that was always there from the beginning of like the man is there to like help you. You went through this hard thing, and I'm here for you as a strong man.
Right.
So I don't need to show my emotion. You show your emotion, and I will be the wall for you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so then we start to see this shift back to the other direction, or sorry, this continued evolution
Mm-hmm.
of the man basically offering more and more vulnerability and more ability to engage with the emotional content. And that's really where it starts to shift, um, again in the last like 5, 10 years in a big way, where we get to Joey here, who's acting like a therapist for the partner, but also being able to receive that support. So it's bilateral.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really what stood out to a lot of, especially women. But it seems like a lot of people who are watching the show broadly was this experience of watching this guy be a role that was seemed rare in men in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder, do you have any stats on like the gender breakup of the production team? Because when I think about this,
I don't.
yeah, okay, yeah, yeah, right. Because like when I think about like the arms race piece, it sounds like that is men being like, oh, what do women want, right? They want a jacked dude. Because I think as men we are very visual, right? And like that's our first thing that we go
Sure.
to is like, oh, like there's a common adage, right? It's like usually when a man gets dumped, the first thing he does is go to the gym. Because he's like, oh, it's because I wasn't
Mm.
ripped enough, right? It's because I wasn't fit enough. It's because I wasn't strong enough,
Yeah.
right? Like that's kind of where we go to because we're also visual. But really, we should be going to therapy,
Sure.
right? Because I think that is what we're learning with this new seasons of The Bachelor, where it's like, oh, it's not that you're not like physically attractive enough; it's you're not emotionally attractive enough. And there's like blocks
Yeah.
or emotional red flags, probably actually more likely, that are pushing
Hmm.
women away from you. You know.
Yeah. That was one of the most, I think, disturbing aspects of watching the show. They've really toned it down lately, but when I first started watching it with my partner, one of the hallmarks of the show is that they would always have one or two people on the season who had pretty significant personality disorder tendencies that
Yeah.
would basically get activated and then ratcheted up and then filmed. And
Mm-hmm.
that was like part of how they would generate the drama. And it was, on the surface, like, oh, that person's so crazy. Like, look at them acting like being insane. But the reality is like they're taking someone who's pretty mentally ill and putting them into a position to like ratchet up the acuity and then film it for profit. And that seemed awful. And there definitely seemed to be a pushback on that over time as, again, the contestants started queuing into this fact of like, this person shouldn't be on this show. Like you're sleep depriving people and feeding them alcohol and then putting them into an extremely competitive, uh, high stress situation, and expecting them to do whatever, um, that it's pretty cruel to do that. And so there seems to be again a backlash against that to some degree, where people are a little bit more prepared to be in that space at this point and aren't having the same level of like full on high acuity breakdowns that have happened historically. Although, of course, it's The Bachelor, so you always have to have a little bit of that, at
Right, you
least in
have
the
like a
beginning.
little like dash of crazy, right, to like get people watching.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the emotional
It
like
used to,
Hunger
it's,
Games or Battle Royale or something. I don't know.
yeah, it is. That's exactly what it feels like.
Yeah.
And again, to the like budding therapist in me, I was like, this is insane. You get to watch uh, so much humanity get
Mhm.
played out in a really bizarre context. It's like a human zoo
Yeah.
in a really tragic way. Um, yeah, it's bizarre.
I I
And it
wonder.
keeps going on.
Yeah, just I guess more I guess logistical questions. Like, I know the show's not live. I imagine they shoot a couple episodes and then they go. Like, do they shoot the whole season and then they air it, or is there like a point in which the contestants are aware of like how the community is responding to them? You know what I'm saying? Like can a contestant go on while the show is being filmed and like look on social media and see what the comments are? Because that adds like a whole nother meta layer of seeing like, oh, this is how like the viewers are now responding to my antics from episode 3 or whatever,
Yeah. I don't know what it is historically. My understanding is that the structure now is that they basically isolate everybody on the show. So if you are kicked off the show, then I think you're still supposed to be like basically like media siloed, and they have you sign like an NDA until the show is released. Um, but so that I think that's the point of that is it's supposed to protect people from doing this like back and forth feedback of like, oh, you liked me being crazy, I'll do it
Right,
more.
exactly, exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
so it's really kind of like it's like they pack it and they take it with them in their suitcase. They're like, all right, I'm going to be this type of person,
Mhm.
or they like, yeah. There was a funny thing that happened a couple of years ago where someone was caught with a Bachelor guide, basically, that someone had handwritten for them in their suitcase. And it had all these things about like how to be successful on the show, which broke the kayfabe. You know, you're not supposed to talk about how there's a ton of rules and norms and expectations and ways that you can game this system in order to be successful. Um, but they did put it into the final cut, which was interesting. Um, Again, coming back to what you said, probably to make fun of it.
Right. That's
But the reality is probably everybody going onto that show has some version of that already stored in their minds. They're getting coached, they're getting
mhm,
trained, they're
mhm.
watching the show, they're taking notes. Yeah, that's my assumption. I don't know, but
But probably, right? I mean, it sounds like I mean, it's a very high profile show at this point, right? So it's like
yeah.
a big deal. That's interesting. I would love to interview somebody from that show that like went in intentionally and like
Hmm.
saw what the strategy was. Like how do you win the relationship game? Um, in the whatever weird context it is. But
Hmm.
yeah, we have to start to wrap up. I guess as we're ending here, what would you say to our listeners that like want to build more of this emotional intelligence to kind of bring it back to therapy or something? Like where should they start if they want to be, the Joey in the world?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I think we kind of talked about it a little bit, but the idea is if we have access to it through community, through like intergenerational relationships of any kind, then we tap into it. Um, for many of us, we didn't get it transmitted to us in our childhoods, and so it seems like the ways to get access to that. So we have to choose to seek it out, which is hard and it takes effort, and that's obviously part of why we are doing MTO, why you started this. Um, and I think, yeah, it's therapy, it's support groups, it's learning, it's talking to our partners and asking for genuine feedback
Mhm.
about this stuff. Because there's obviously we are all different and we all have varying levels of skill and maturity in the face of this stuff. Um, but as a general rule, women in general are getting a lot more of this stuff socialized into them early on. And we can learn a ton about how to do this more effectively by asking for feedback and responding to it and being a little bit more fluid with how we respond. A lot of it's like behavioral stuff. We have these old adages like fake it to make it. And a lot of it is just starting with that.
Mhm.
Figure out like what can I say in order to help someone feel safe and work with that. And then we create ideally enough safety and familiarity with that, and we start building up from there.
Yeah, I think that's well said, right? It's like just try it, and yeah, I love that you're saying just like ask for feedback because they know. And yeah, I guess to the guys out there, like the bar is being raised, which is good for everybody, including us, even though it can be intimidating
Hmm.
sometimes. Like it's good for everybody. So I think it's really worth learning these skills, whether it be in therapy or from a mentor or a friend or an older family member. Like it is really critical. So
Yeah.
Desmond, thanks so much for being on the show. Where can people find you if they want to learn more about you?
I guess I have a Psychology Today profile.
Yep,
You can find me on the MTO website. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
check
My
them out.
MySpace doesn't exist anymore, I
Right,
don't
you want
think.
your MySpace, your number one Bachelor fan, MySpace.
Yeah. Find my
But
bachelor bracket.
right. But no, this has been a really great conversation, humorous and yet poignant. I mean, there's a lot there. There's a lot there, and it's important, I think, to study this stuff because, like you were saying, this is what the youth is being exposed to, right? This is like how the norms
Mhm.
are actively being set in our culture. So it's really important to pay attention to this kind of thing. So Desmond, thanks so much for being on the show, and I know you'll be on again in the future.
Next reality TV show. We'll find it.
We'll do it. And listeners, thanks so much for tuning in.
Thanks,
We'll
Mark.
see you another episode of the Men's Therapy Podcast.